Canada's new government is deploying a similar combination of innovation, speed, and long hours through Build Canada Homes. And it's consistent with Canada's history. Our history is one of adventurers, risk takers, and above all, builders.
Imagine a moment when the familiar political scene cracks open, and what is usually hidden beneath layers of diplomacy suddenly flashes before the cameras. A moment when a man known for his composure, precision, and almost icy calm stops speaking in hints and starts telling the truth. The unofficial truth, the unvarnished truth, the truth that is usually never spoken aloud. Today we witnessed just such a moment. The interview you are about to see is already being called the most powerful political revelation in recent years. Not because it was about the latest negotiations or diplomatic formalities, and not because former U.S. President Donald Trump was in the frame, but because for the first time in a long time, an honest, blunt, and ruthless assessment was given of what was happening behind closed doors, to which only a select few have access. We are used to seeing Canadian diplomacy as soft, courteous, and predictably restrained. We are used to thinking that even the toughest moments in international relations remain behind the scenes, that public statements are just a polite shell for real processes. But today's conversation turns that perception on its head. For the first time, we have the opportunity to look into the Oval Office not through the eyes of cameras, but through the eyes of a person who had to sit across from Trump and decide how to respond to his words, facial expressions, and emotional outbursts. A person who saw not the televised version of American power, but its raw, impulsive, unbridled reality. What really happened when the doors closed? What was said in those moments when no one was recording? What were the negotiations like when one wrong word could destroy months of work? And most importantly, why are we hearing today what was previously kept silent? This conversation is not just commentary on politics. It is a break from the norm. It is an acknowledgement that relations between Canada and the United States were changing much faster and more profoundly than we thought. That at some point, diplomacy ceased to be diplomacy and became an attempt to maintain basic order in the face of unpredictability. But the most surprising thing is not the scale of the disagreements, nor is it the complexity of the negotiations. The most surprising thing is the conclusion that can be read between the lines. America was changing, Canada was changing, but most of all, expectations were changing. And one day it became clear. The old era was over. Today you will hear words that are rarely spoken aloud. Words that usually end up in closed reports, not on the air. Words that force us to rethink the role of Canada, the role of the United States, and the direction of relations between the two countries. This is not just an interview, it is a political X-ray. It is the moment when a reserved person stops holding back, when diplomacy gives way to reality, when the masks come off. And what you are about to hear may change your understanding of how global politics really works. It didn't happen all at once, not in one specific moment, but like a growing tension in the air, as if before a storm. He was silent for a long time. He behaved diplomatically. He responded in a measured, sometimes even impersonal manner. Canadian restraint worked as a shield. But this time, he let his guard down. And suddenly it became clear. The conversations that had been going on behind the scenes for years were now public knowledge. The walls came down. The cameras were rolling. The microphones caught every word. The man who had previously chosen his words with surgical precision now spoke sharply, quickly, and scathingly, without filters. On that day, he entered the studio not as a banker, not as an economist, not as a diplomat. He entered as a witness, as a man tired of keeping the truth to himself. From the very first minutes of the interview, it became clear that this was not just a political conversation. It was an expose. He did not accuse directly, he did not shout. But his voice conveyed something that is rarely heard from a person of his stature: a deep, accumulated anger. He began not with loud statements, but with memories about what their first meeting was like. A small detail. As is customary in international politics, he addressed his interlocutor by name and title, with respect. But in response, he heard only the familiar Mark. No formalities. He hates being called Donald, he said with a smirk, but he allows himself to be familiar at every meeting. At first, it seemed like a strange habit. Then, part of the game. And soon it became clear. It was a demonstration of power. Such a maneuver in diplomacy is not accidental. It is the language of power without words. He said the negotiations were like a minefield. Every meeting was like an exam. Don't overdo it. Don't correct yourself. Don't breathe loudly. In the Oval Office, the air was thick, like in an underground bunker. Not a single window, dozens of eyes fixed on you, and one man with the most powerful army in the world and the #1 economy behind him. One wrong move and the situation explodes. He recounted how, in one conversation, the issue of aluminum tariffs was discussed, a common topic. But instead of a dry business conversation, he heard a lecture on how Canada would be better off as the 51st state, said with a half smile, half joking. But it sounded like a challenge, and he did not remain silent. The answer was firm. Never, never, never. The audience applauded, but at that moment there was a deathly silence in the room. Such words are not uttered in diplomatic circles. But he did. Because it was no longer about trade, it was not about taxes. It was a question of dignity. One of the journalists asked if it was difficult to restrain himself in such circumstances. He replied without hesitation, very. He described how the U.S. president ignored the agenda, steering the conversation toward domestic American issues. It was as if Canada was present at the meeting as an extra, not a strategic partner. "You're invited to just sit and nod," he said. At one point, it even felt like the relationship between the countries was not an alliance, but a performance where one side always got the leading role. He said that Trump changed the data. He would say one thing, and the next day he would say the opposite. When asked about the real trade balance figures, he simply dismissed the question. "We have our own statistics." "It's not a mistake," he said. "It's a strategy. Distorting the facts is a way of exerting pressure." When discussing Trump's actions outside of official meetings, he raised the issue of nighttime messages for the first time. Yes, it sounds almost comical. The president of a superpower writes at 3:47 a.m., using only capital letters and 5 exclamation points. But behind it was not a joke. It was unpredictability. And unpredictability at the level of heads of state is a threat. "It wasn't a dialogue," he said. "It was pressure." And all this lasted not a week, not a month. Years. Years on the brink. Years of waiting for the next emotional outburst, not to lead to the breakdown of decades of economic cooperation. "When you're not sure if your ally will wake up tomorrow, in a state of declaring a trade war," he said, "you start to rethink the very idea of an alliance." But perhaps the most powerful moment is not the words about what Trump was like. It is the recognition that Canada is no longer waiting. It is not waiting for the U.S. to make up its mind. It is not waiting for internal conflicts to subside. It is not waiting for a convenient partner to come to power. This moment was not just a reaction to one person. It was the point at which an entire era came to an end. An era of dependence, an era of automatic agreement, an era of belief that Washington would always be the rational center of the West. He said it calmly, almost cold-bloodedly. "Canada no longer counts on America. We are coming out of the shadows." And that said it all. Because in reality, this interview was not so much about Trump as it was about Canada itself, about its new political maturity, about how a crisis abroad became a catalyst for internal transformation. At the end of the interview, he was asked if he felt relieved. He thought for a moment and replied, "Oh, no, it's not relief. It's just the truth. One that needed to be said out loud a long time ago." And at that moment, it became clear that this was not a spontaneous admission. It was a calculated, conscious step. He knew what he was doing. He knew that his words would make headlines, that in the US they would be perceived as betrayal, and in Canada as a manifesto. And he said it anyway. Because in politics, there comes a moment when silence is no longer neutrality, but complicity. That was the end of the first act. Officially, it was an interview. In essence, it was a turning point. And it seems that from that day on, Canada really did start talking differently. No one expected that an external threat would suddenly unite the country, especially a threat without gunfire, without an army, without sanctions. It was a threat of a different kind. It came from a neighbor, from someone with whom bridges had been built for decades. Deals had been made and pacts of mutual respect had been signed. But at some point, this neighbor became a source of instability. And it was then that Canada, as it turned out, proved to be stronger than anyone thought. Carney did not try to play the hero. He spoke calmly, almost detachedly, but every word hit the mark. The paradox is, he noted, that Trump did not divide Canada. He united it. This conclusion sounded like a provocation, too simple, too straightforward. But then he began to explain, and everything fell into place. Against the backdrop of political turmoil in the U.S., with rallies, outbreaks of violence, canceled meetings, threats to the media, and constant statements on social media, Canada looked like an island of stability. But behind that stability lay fear. Fear that any morning could begin with a new tweet that would destroy exports, impose tariffs, or launch another wave of information pressure. At that moment, many Canadians had a revelation. He said that in the past, in large cities such as Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal, attitudes toward the United States had always been ambivalent. On the one hand, respect, and on the other, quiet envy of its scale, opportunities, and influence. But after 2017, the envy disappeared. Canadians began to see themselves not as a reflection of America, but in opposition to it, he said. And it wasn't about anti-Americanism. It was about self-identification. This was especially noticeable among the younger generation. Universities across the country began to change their curricula. More courses on the domestic economy, Canadian history, and independent foreign policy. New student movements emerged, demanding that the government break with the illusion of integration. In some ways, this was naive, but overall it reflected the demands of society. And the government listened. In an interview, Carney mentioned an internal document prepared back in 2018, in which analysts directly recommended preparing the country for a period of forced self-sufficiency. No one had talked about it before. It had not been published, but now it has become part of the discussion. Canada must be prepared to no longer rely on the U.S. as a reliable economic or political partner. This attitude became key in the negotiations he conducted during those years. Carney recalled how the discussion of one of the trade amendments lasted 11 hours, and at one point the U.S. delegation simply got up from the table, threatening to withdraw from the agreement. The reason? The wording in which Canada refused to automatically follow U.S. certification standards. A trifle, it would seem. But not for Washington. Where Trump and his entourage saw subordination, Carney defended partnership. He said that the U.S. was negotiating not as an ally, but as a dominant party. This is not a dialogue, it is dictation with pauses, he said succinctly. And in this tense atmosphere, a formula was born which he would later voice publicly. We will not sign a bad deal. We will not even sign a good one. We will only sign a great deal for Canada. Words that were initially perceived as political rhetoric actually reflected a new philosophy. The Canadian delegation did not negotiate on its knees, not in an attempt to keep everything as it is, but with the understanding that the old had already been destroyed and it was time to build something new. He mentioned that when revising one of the energy agreements, Canada insisted on including a clause on sovereign right of refusal, allowing the agreement to be frozen without penalty if necessary. Previously, this had not even been discussed. Now it has become the norm. Carney spoke at length about Trump's style as a negotiator. He emphasized that, from a tactical standpoint, Trump was flawless, experienced, aggressive, with an amazing instinct for his opponent's vulnerabilities. But it was precisely this aggression that destroyed long-term relationships. "You can't build an alliance if you're being tested every day," he said.